Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dwayne Leach, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first in a series of distinguished lectures sponsored by the University of Texas Permian Basin and the John Ben Shepperd Public Leadership Institute. These lectures will focus on the role and significance of public leadership in determining our nation's future as well as our state's. Our program this evening is a roundtable town hall discussion on the topic of presidential leadership in the 21st century. Our moderator this evening is Mr. George Christian of Austin, Texas. Mr. Christian has had a distinguished career in public service of nearly 4 decades, serving as press secretary to Governors Price, Daniel, and John Conley, and serving Lyndon Baines Johnson in that same capacity from 1966 until 1969. An author, an editor, a political consultant, a gentleman in the truest sense of the word, Mr. Christian's wise counsel is sought by any and all seeking to come to understand the mystique of Texas. On a more personal note, it seems almost fitting that George Christian should moderate this first series of discussions. A longtime advocate of this young campus, a cherished friend of John Ben Shepperd and his lovely wife, Mamie, and a key figure and friend in assisting us to bring together this distinguished panel. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome our moderator, George Christian.
Thanks, Dwayne, and I also want to welcome you to this forum, and particularly would like to note the presence of Mamie Shepperd of Odessa and Gladewater. I put Odessa first here. If it was in Gladewater, I'd say Gladewater and Odessa, I guess, but Mamie is here with us tonight, and we appreciate that very much. And Jim Meacham, longtime friend and co-worker, John Ben's and Mamie's, is with her. This institute is named for a Texan who lived so many lives, all marked by great accomplishment, that the legislature saw fit to perpetuate his memory in this way. His most fervent desire, I think, was that new generations of leaders would be encouraged to become involved in public life to the fullest possible extent. Most of you know that John Ben served as Secretary of State and as Attorney General of Texas. I first met him earlier than that when I was a 22-year-old reporter, and he was serving a brief term, on the new State Board of Education, which was then launching a massive reform of the public school system. Seems to me that we have these massive reforms of public schools recommended periodically. Well, this was the first one, stuck for a while. I worked with him many other ways over the years, and one particular enterprise that he was greatly interested in was to be sure that Texans recognized their heritage and did all they could to preserve it. He designed this university for all practical purposes. He fought for its creation more than any single person. He got it created. He was a leader in the purest sense, and this is the kind of event he hoped this university would foster to impress upon all of us, and especially young people, that leadership is hardly a birthright, but a quality that must be learned and nourished over a lifetime. The business at hand is presidential leadership and the 21st century. Dwayne has assembled 4 distinguished journalists to explore this subject from every perspective. Each will express a viewpoint for a few minutes. Then we'll engage in an interchange among the panelists, and we'll take questions and comments from the floor. I hope you all have some questions. This is supposed to be a town hall meeting, so if anything's on your mind, let us hear. We hope you'll be as brief as you can, and the panelists will do their best not to filibuster the answers. There are microphones on both sides of the room, and it would be helpful if you would use those mics. If the questions can't be heard, I'll try to relay them. I'm going to, I think in your material that you probably got at the door, there are biographical sketches of these panelists, so I'll just hit the high points to show you their credentials. And they'll be introduced here in this order. First will be Paul Taylor, who is director of the Free TV for Straight Talk Coalition. That's a group that's seeking to persuade television networks to donate free airtime to the principal candidates for president. He is a reformer at heart, and this is a reform that's probably badly needed. He was a newspaper reporter for 25 years. The last 14 was at the Washington Post, where he covered national political campaigns and social issues. He was the Post bureau chief in South Africa during the change in governments, the transformation from apartheid to democracy. He left the Post in January of this year. He's the author of a book, See How They Run, about the 1988 presidential campaign, and co-author of a 20th Century Fund paper, The Old News versus the New News, which is about political journalism. He's been a visiting professor at Princeton University, and prior to joining the Post, he worked for the Twin Cities Sentinel in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. He's also worked in Texas during his time with the Post. Next will be Rena Pederson, who is vice president and editor of the editorial page of the Dallas Morning News. She has overall responsibility for the opinion pages of the news, so if you don't like them, let her know about it.
Thank you, George.
She's been on the staff of the Dallas News since 1973, and as she said earlier to us, she's covered everything except sports. She's been a federal beat reporter, feature writer, radio TV editor, and editor of the Viewpoints page. Prior to that, she was a wire service reporter with the UPI first and then with the Associated Press, and she also worked for the Washington Bureau of the Houston Chronicle. She is a UT Austin graduate with honors. She is president of the National Conference of Editorial Writers. In 1987, she might not want me to mention this, but it's pertinent, I think. In 1987, Texas Monthly named Rena Pederson as one of the most powerful women in Texas, which is a pretty high honor for a journalist. Third on our panel will be John Mashek. He was political correspondent for the Boston Globe prior to a few months ago when he began a year-long stint as a visiting professional scholar at the Freedom Forum First Amendment Center in Nashville, Tennessee. He is examining in that position the media coverage of the 1996 presidential campaign. John started with the Dallas News in 1955 as a county courthouse and local political reporter. He moved to the Washington Bureau of the News in 1960, and his main responsibility was covering the Texas delegation to Congress, which at that time included both Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn. In '64, he joined the staff of U.S. News and World Report and moved to Houston to open the Southwest Bureau. He went back to Washington in 1970 and was the chief congressional correspondent, then took the White House beat in August '74 when President Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford took office. He remained White House correspondent for 2+ years that Ford was in office, and then the first 2 years of Jimmy Carter's administration. He became political editor of U.S. News and served in that capacity till he left the magazine 10 years ago or so to be a correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and then went to the Boston Globe, which is one of the outstanding regional newspapers in this country and a highly quoted political newspaper. You may recognize John from the presidential debates. He's been a reporter, a panelist on so many of them now that he's got a media image, I guess. But he was in the Ferraro-Bush debate in '84, Dukakis and Bush in '88, Clinton-Bush and Perot in '92. He's graduated at the University of Minnesota. Proud to say one of his sons is at the University of Texas at Austin. Gerald Seib, on my far left, will be the cleanup batter. He received his degree from the University of Kansas. He's a native of western Kansas. He was a reporting intern in Dallas for Dow Jones, so almost all these folks have had at least a brush, well, I guess all of them have had a brush with Texas. He was with the Dallas Bureau of the Wall Street Journal as a reporter, and then transferred to the Washington Bureau and covered the Pentagon and the State Department. He covered the Middle East from the Cairo Bureau, and he has covered the White House and reported on diplomacy and foreign policy in Washington since the late 80s. He is in '92, he became a news editor responsible for the journal's national political coverage from Washington and around the country. He won the Merriman Smith Award, which honors coverage of the presidency under deadline, and has won a number of other awards, including a prize for coverage of the Gulf War. He writes the weekly Capital Journal column for the journal's politics and policy page. So first on our panel, and I'll ask you to come up here, Paul, if you'd like, to the microphone, is Paul Taylor.
Thank you, George, and thank you for having me. The only thing left out of my introduction was that this is actually my second trip to this campus. I was here in 1983. I was a reporter for the Post based in Austin covering the Southwest, and I was doing a feature story on James Michener, who was then researching his novel on Texas, and he came out here to do some research about well drilling for a cotton farmer. And he came and he gave a little talk, I think, in the lobby out here. And if I don't remember all the details, except I thought to myself, this man is imparting a lot of wisdom this afternoon. So if I do about 1/10 of what he did, you'll be lucky, and I'll have a very good night here. Let me open by picking up a quote that is on this the flyer advertising this evening's symposium, and it's a quote from Alexander Hamilton, which says, "In the early days of the American Republic, Alexander Hamilton predicted that a time would come when, quote, every vital question of state will be merged in the question, who will be the next president?" Well, here we are in a presidential election year. We are about the business of answering that question, who will be the next president? And let me briefly run through the questions that have been subsumed under that question to see whether they really are vital questions of state. And let's start with the current occupant of the Oval Office, President Clinton, who's looking to re-up for 4 years. What has he been talking about? What vital questions of state has he been talking about for the last several weeks? A new 911 number to replace the current 911 number, which he believes is overburdened. His belief that students ought to have school uniforms. His belief that teenagers ought to have curfews. His belief that cellular phones for crime watch programs are a good thing. Those are the things he's for. What are the things he's against? He's against teen smoking. He's against deadbeat dads. He's against repeat sex offenders living next door to you and you not knowing about it. He's against violence on television. He's against truancy. Now, are all of these things important to where people live and breathe? You bet they are. Are they vital questions of state? It seems to me they probably are not. There was an article on the front page of the New York Times this morning that was describing the strategy behind this kind of campaigning, and the reporter described what Clinton is talking about, the set of initiatives Clinton is talking about as, quote, small but worthy. And it seems to me that as we think about presidential leadership as the century is coming to an end, small but worthy is not a bad paradigm to start from. We are in an era of deep skepticism, really cynicism, about political leaders and about political institutions. The people don't seem to trust the leaders to do the right thing, and they seem to be happiest when the leaders don't try to do all that much. And if you just look over the course of the 3.5 years of the Clinton presidency, it really falls into two distinct patterns. Clinton was sort of on the offensive in the first 2 years, tried to reform the health system, tried to bite off, 1/7 of the economy. That came aground. Then the Republicans had their big win in 1994. They were on the initiative with the contract with America, but basically the big ticket items in that contract came aground. So I think that the lesson has been learned certainly by Bill Clinton, and as he has moved towards the center, he seems to be turning the old adage on its face, and he seems to realize that what the voters want from their political leaders is to don't just do something, stand there. So he concentrates on issues that sort of get people where they live, and it seems to be working. Why have our expectations, we're sort of in an era of sort of a declining expectations towards government. Why has that happened, and what consequences does it have for leadership? It seems to me that it's easy enough to point to some of the historical factors. The cynicism, a lot of the cynicism began with the Watergate Vietnam era. A lot of the people who came of age politically in that time are now in positions of leadership in my old profession, in particular journalism, and bring this very, very deep skepticism, and I think sort of contribute to the jaded eye that people take. And the jadedness is not just about policy. The jadedness increasingly is also about the character of presidential leadership. There was a poll that actually George quoted at a press conference earlier this afternoon. George, your poll numbers, it was the same set of questions. It piqued your curiosity just as it did mine, although you had a CNN poll asking those. I have some numbers from the Gallup poll. But it's a fascinating anomaly. This is a Gallup poll taken about a month ago. They asked the American public, do you think Bill Clinton is honest and trustworthy? And by a slim plurality, 49 to 46, the majority or a plurality of Americans says, no, we don't think Bill Clinton is honest and trustworthy. Then they asked those same people, do you think Bill Clinton has the honesty and integrity to serve as president? And by 62 to 36, they say, yes, he does. Now, what is that telling us? That is telling us that Americans, at the close of this century, think that their president is crooked, but he is ethically fit to serve in his office. Now, as somebody commented, maybe Americans are becoming a little bit more like the French, who are sort of famous as the jaded Europeans who believe that everyone has a little larceny in his heart and don't expect too much and are willing to put up with a much higher threshold of kind of personal peccadillos and skullduggery. Whereas the Americans have always sort of, in our political culture, been the naifs, the moralists, the people who believe in holding people to the highest standard. I think maybe we are losing some of our political naivete, for better or for worse, and there are probably elements of both. I think part of the explanation of this is clearly technological, and it clearly has to do with television, although it seems like all of us it's hard to imagine a world where television didn't exist. Television has really only been around for 45 or 50 years. It's a speck of dust in world and human history, and it has provoked these enormous changes, I think, in particular in the way leaders and followers interact. Because of television, our leaders come into our living rooms and our dens and our kitchens, and they expose themselves as human beings with all the frailties and warts that all human beings have. And it creates, because of television, we sort of know how the sausage is made in our public life, and we know the warts of our leaders. And there's no getting around that, and it seems to me we are still, as a people, as humankind is still in the process of figuring out that you can recognize that human beings do sometimes have feet of clay, but still can be worthy individuals and worthy leaders. I think we're working that through. As I said, I think some of the cynicism is also very much a function of sort of a lagging holdover from post-Vietnam, post-Watergate. We're sort of stuck with this horrible deficit, which I think people think is an indictment of the political process. It's not working very well. But what I find fascinating, if you stand back, if this very cynical public would stand back, I spent 3 years out of the United States in the mid-90s, from 92 to 95 in South Africa, had a fascinating story to cover there, but it was also fascinating to have spent 20 years before that covering politics in this country, and then for the first time in my life be away and look at my own country from across an ocean. And the country I saw from 8,000 miles away was fabulously rich. You know, the economy, it couldn't be doing better. All the indicators that we have been taught to look at in terms of unemployment, in terms of growth, in terms of inflation, the numbers are all moving in the right direction. Here we are, we've at the end of a century where we have conquered fascism in the first half of the century, we conquered communism in the second half of the century. Our ideals about democracy, our movies, our music, our currency have in effect colonized the world. We are the top dog and there's no second dog. And maybe this is part of our problem as a society and part of the reason we're kind of in a valley. We don't have a clear enemy. We don't have the organizing theme of the Cold War. You go to the movies these days, and in order to find a big enemy, we have to concoct space invaders, and we can make a lot of money doing that. So I think maybe some of this cynicism and malaise is a kind of a temporary thing as we adjust to these new circumstances. We're gazing at our navels. We're finding that there's a lot of lint in. We are certainly not a perfect society by any means. We got many problems. But maybe some of it will pass. But I think there are some structural realities that I think all presidents from here on in are going to have to learn how to deal with. One of them has to do, as I say, with this intensely personal nature of politics that is a function of the television camera. This country used to have stronger political parties, certainly in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, than it did today, but it has never been a particularly strong partisan nation. If you go to the parliamentary democracies of Europe, you will see a much more structured party system where parties kind of create cover for individual politicians. They give a coherent set of ideals and ideologies. Our politicians are sort of out there on their own. They exist largely free of parties, which are basically there to help them raise some money and to do some kind of mechanical things. So they're exposed. And they're exposed to what can be a very withering media climate in a cynical age. The reporters in a cynical age are ultimately, they are both chroniclers of the cynicism, but in some ways they are carriers of the cynicism. They will reflect this cynicism and they will enforce it. The other truth about our presidential system is that it doesn't, and it never was intended to have a great deal of constitutional power. As we all know from our American history, the framers of the Constitution were skeptical of all forms of organized power, so they created this elaborate system of checks and balances. And the president, I think most presidential scholars have come to the view it's the bully pulpit, it's the ability for moral leadership that gives the office of the presidency much, if not most, of its power. With this system of checks and balances that the framers wrote, what we have done for the last 45 or 50 years or so in this cynical era is add another layer of checks and balances, which I don't think was intended, which is the notion of divided party control, where you have a president of one party, as we currently do, and a Congress dominated by another party. Now, for the 50 or 60 years before, I think it's 1955, this had been the case in about 14% of the time, that you had a president of one party, a Congress of another. Since 1955, this has been the case 2/3 of the time. So we have almost, whether consciously or subconsciously, it seems that these very skeptical voters have added another layer of checks and balances onto a system. Now, what does that do to leadership? It seems to me it almost assures and almost guarantees that you will get the kind of spectacles that we all witnessed 6 or 8 months ago as the Gingrich Congress and Clinton sort of locked horns at the end of that session over the budget. And you remember those 2 or 3 shutdowns of the government, and gridlock and train wrecks are now sort of part of our vocabulary. We are not an ideological people. This is another anomaly and a structural difficulty of leadership. We are not like the conservatives and the Laborites of England, and never have been. Colin Powell, when he was briefly flirting with the presidency, running for the presidency, talked about the sensible center where most 60-70% of Americans reside. An additional anomaly of our system is that, yes, that's where most Americans are, but particularly in our Congress, we have a Congress that is sharply partisan, and as partisan as it has been almost at any time in our history. So you got the people in the middle wanting sort of middling solutions, and you have a very partisan Congress, very conservative Republicans, very liberal Democrats, and the result, again, is going to be conflict. When a president, such as a Clinton, comes in, or a Bush before him, who are essentially not particularly ideological figures, who do want to find the golden mean and strike the right compromise, we instinctively don't like that in a president. We prefer the Reagan model, of go ahead, make my day. A man who, whether you agree with him or not, everybody knows he stands for a few simple, strong things. So that's sort of our image of what presidential leadership should be about. But it's very hard to exercise that kind of leadership given these sort of structural discontinuities or dysfunctions that we've created for ourselves. I don't mean to suggest that the Western civilization or democracy, as we've been practicing it for 220 years, is under threat. Another lesson one gets affirmed if you live outside your country is the incredible strength, resilience, and dynamism of the American democracy. We are not going down the toilet. We don't have a legitimacy crisis. We have a lot of people, I think unnecessarily, who think that politics and government is worse than it really is. And let me end my remarks with a sort of very brief ad for what I got frustrated after 20 or 25 years of covering politics as a journalist for the Washington Post and some other papers, feeling in some ways journalism was implicated in this sort of vicious cycle where the journalists and the politicians and the voters were all bringing out the worst in each other. And I decided to take a bit of a leap and pursue a reform that I would place in the small but worthy category of reforms. This is not going to save the world, but it seems to me it's a smart idea that tries to engage politics as it is practiced and make it a little better. And the reform is this. The predicate for the reform is that I think the place where the seeds of the cynicism are planted more than anywhere else is during political campaigns. They are big events. Presidential campaigns are big events. This one has gotten off to a slow start, but at some point it'll engage and people will pay attention. It sets a tone for the ongoing conversation of our democracy. It sets the kind of relationship that leaders and followers have. Unfortunately, more and more political campaigns happen on television, and you have a conversation that is structured around a format of the 30-second attack ad and now the 7-second soundbite, which is the length of time that a candidate for president is quoted on the network evening news. This is not a healthy form. It seems to me some of the disengagement and the anger at the system is built simply around that format. 30-second. The typical attack ad, it's not the attack that I think bothers people so much about that. It's because politics ought to be a back and forth of ideas. It's that in the typical attack ad, the candidate paying for the ad doesn't appear. The ad is about the opponent. It's about the dumb thing the opponent did 12 years ago, taken out of context. You don't have to make any charges. You just let the viewer, who's already inclined to believe that he's a jerk anyway, you let the viewer infer the worst. These ads work, but understand how that's why they're used. They do work. They move the numbers, as the pollsters like to say, but they work not by persuading your supporters to vote for you. They work by persuading people who might have been inclined to vote for your opponent not to vote at all. And I don't think it's an accident that in the 20 or 25 years that this has become the dominant mode of conversation, our turnout has gone down, our cynicism has gone up. Similarly, the 7-second soundbite. 20, 25 years ago, the average length of time a candidate was quoted on the network evening news was 42 seconds. Now it's down to 7 seconds. In 7 seconds, you have plenty of time to say, read my lips, no new taxes. You have plenty of time to say, I feel your pain. You don't have enough time to say that public policy choices are often complicated. They sometimes demand compromise. They sometimes demand sacrifice. You're stuck in a sort of attack, pander, deceive mode of discourse. My little fix, my small but worthy fix, is to go to the television networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, PBS, Fox, and say, look, why don't you help the political process out of its current televised swamp? Why don't you give the candidates a few minutes a night, starting, let's say, around the beginning of October through election days, just the last month or so of the campaign, a few minutes a night just to talk directly to the American public. The candidates will have to understand for those few minutes, they and they alone will be on the screen. Stick it in the middle of prime time, in between the sitcoms, where you have the biggest audience in America assembled every night, including disproportionately an audience that has dropped out of the system because it has seen these campaigns unfold time and again, and it says, I don't want anything to do with them. I'm not going to pay attention. I'm not going to vote. You know, we do have on television, if you